Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Charting Evolving FinServ Cyber Threats. Please note that you will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters through the Q&A screen. In addition, the webinar is being recorded and will be available to you and your colleagues later today on the Cooperative Systems website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us today. My name is John Feld, and I'll be your moderator. I'm pleased to welcome our speakers today, Steve Leventhal, CEO at Felsway Group, and Scott Spatz, partner and CEO at Cooperative Systems. Before we move forward, Steve and Scott, can you offer a little more background about your organizations and responsibilities? And we'll start with you, Steve, please.
Sure. Thanks, John. Good afternoon, folks. Happy to be here. Steve Leventhal, CEO of Felsway Group. We are a cyber risk advisory services firm and a close partner of Cooperative Systems. Our whole focus is helping organizations really to treat cyber as a business risk, which means that the efforts that we're supporting is helping our clients to build resilience into their organization.
Thanks, Steve. Scott?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Spatz, the president of Cooperative Systems. Our team here at Cooperative Systems, we provide outsourced managed IT and cybersecurity solutions to the SMB financial services sector. And we're happy to be hosting today's webinar as part of our overall Cybersecurity Summit series, which we've had comprised of both webinars and in-person events. And the intention there is really to educate the business community on important initiatives to keep your business running securely and while keeping your customers' data really out of the hands of the bad guys. So we're looking forward to today's event.
Thank you. Again, on behalf of Cooperative Systems, I'd like to welcome everybody to Charting Evolving FinServ Cyber Threats. Successful cyber attacks in the financial services sector are growing year over year, with twice as many unique cyber incidents reported in 2023 as the year before. Higher level DDoS attacks, malware explicitly targeting operational technology, the emerging ransom as a service trend, and other cyber attacks are creating a related increase in data leaks, monetary and data theft, and large-scale disruptions. Overall, exploitations of vulnerabilities in this sector increased by 55% in 2023. Not only is the threat landscape and vector growing, but increasingly sophisticated cybercriminals are exploiting new entry points into networks and using dwell time to find and abscond with data, money, and other valuable corporate assets. Understanding what and where the threats are coming from is the first step to creating an effective cybersecurity bulwark against attack. Today, Steve and Scott will explore the current and emerging threat landscape, cybercriminal access points, mitigation steps, and more. So let's set the table. Currently, as the stats above illustrate, cyber attacks in the FinServ space are escalating. They are taking longer to detect. Many companies aren't adequately prepared, and the cost per incident is skyrocketing. So all that into account, Steve, how would you describe the current cyber threat landscape?
Well, I think the word that you have on the screen here, John, is appropriate, right? It is a very noisy environment. Excuse me. What we see is an increasing amount of noise. It's coming from various directions, right? Obviously, these stats are pretty indicative of what's going on from kind of from the attacker side, from the threat and risk side. But what we're seeing is those activities are starting to have real world impact on our customers, and where that really manifests itself is in a number of different ways, right? So we are seeing the regulatory and compliance landscape starting to catch up to the threat in the marketplace. We're seeing new and evolving laws and regs and standards that are being rolled out and holding companies accountable to. The insurance market we've seen over the past probably 18 to 24 months has been tightening significantly. I should say the cyber insurance. The underwriting requirements for obtaining and maintaining cyber insurance have become much more stringent. This also affects organizations in terms of from an internal stakeholder perspective, right? Senior leadership is starting to ask the right questions, which is a good thing, but that means that there's, actions that need to be taken to be able to respond and report, to those inquiries. And finally, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of, I guess you could say, attestation requests that are coming from customers, right? So, looking at, everybody, every organization has, has suppliers that they deal with, and every organization is a supplier to somebody. And so that third party risk, or that vendor risk, supply chain risk, is, really starting to get, significant notice or traction. And what that means is, more questions are being asked. So, when we talk about it being a noisy environment, it's stakeholders from all directions that are asking for, not only the capabilities, organizations to be able to, demonstrate that they have the capabilities, to protect the stakeholder interest, but, also the ability to, to report, on those capabilities as well.
So it's fair to say that it's not just the threat that exists, it's the extent and reach of the threat, but it also has a ripple effect beyond just the financial services sector to everybody they serve, which kind of highlights the critical nature of it. And Scott, how have you seen financial services companies respond?
Yeah, I'll echo, some of the same things that Steve just mentioned, but, what we're seeing as part of the additional scrutiny across the industry is just the increase in frequency of audits, as well as more scrutiny on the third-party vendors that you do business with, especially those that have any access to or control over your network. But third-party risk management is a big component of overall cyber risk mitigation, and we're seeing that with governing bodies and insurance requirements as well. And really, whether you have internal IT or outsourced IT, it really doesn't matter. The increase in the auditing is occurring for both. Again, whether you staff your own IT department or not, that requirement and the oversight is what we're seeing more so of. And as you can see on the slide here, the number of cyber attacks, cost, and the the people who are not prepared. I'm losing my word at the tip of my tongue. Sorry.
Yeah.
People who are not the prepared organizations, both the regulating bodies and the insurance companies, are requiring the increased frequency of those audits. So, in addition, we're seeing increased investments in cybersecurity tool sets, which is thankfully a good thing, and it's more affordable than they've ever been in the marketplace. And some of these tool sets really provide that increased visibility into your networks to identify those possible threats before they get to do bad things, or before your network gets shut down. And as the slide states here too, on average, financial services businesses take 233 days to detect and contain a breach. We absolutely need to get that number down, and we'll drill into some of the technical details a little bit later.
Thank you, Scott. So as far as why financial services companies are targets, it sounds a little trite to focus on assets, but that's part of it, where we say that's where the money is. Steve, what else attracts cyber criminals to FinServ organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to say, that's where the money is, right? The old Willie Sutton line, when asked, why he robbed banks, I think it was. Well, that's where the money is, right? And I think we all know that, the value of that data, it does depend on the motivation of the hacker, but there are various motivations, many of them which are monetarily driven, and I think we'll get into that further in in one of the subsequent slides here. But the data is valuable, right? It's often, if it's not actual, beyond just being financial data, there's sensitive information associated with that, oftentimes, which again is of value. I think the fact that financial transactions, by nature, typically there's a high volume. It's high transaction volume, right? Which makes it a more complex environment, which makes it, the more complexity you add into any structure, the easier it is to find the potential vulnerability or weakness. So it's kind of we talk about the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when you talk about financial data, really all three of those pillars apply, which again makes it drive some of those motivations that we'll talk about in a minute.
So we know clearly that those assets are critical, but there's also the standpoint of these people are obviously good at what they do, and it's the data they're seeking. So Scott, can you speak to that aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the ability to access your customers or your members' personal information is the key thing, right? And the ability to target those customers individually and pointedly, whether it's opening credit in their names or any other types of financial crimes, by them being able to possess or have access to your individual personal data. And let's also remember that the people that we're talking about here, that this is their job. The threat actors, it's their job. It's their 9-to-5 job, just like any one of us. It's our job to find the breaks and the cracks, and it's their job to do the exact same thing on the other side. Sometimes we're proactive and we're able to stop that from happening, but sometimes we have to be reactive, and it's the same thing with them. Again, we got to remember that these aren't people, sitting in their basements in the dark with hoods over their heads trying to compromise networks. These are professionally run organizations that have leadership teams, management teams, just like your business and our business. They have quotas, they have expectations, and they're held to their objectives and held to their what they're employed to do. And they're run just like any other professional business. So it's serious stuff.
Yep. We think about the expectations we have of our own businesses and those we work with, no different for them than it is for us. Scott, what are the kind of the core vulnerabilities in FinServ networks and systems?
Sure. Yeah, as you can see on the slide there, it's people. Biggest vulnerability across any computing environment or any network infrastructure is the people, and this isn't specific to financial services organizations. So the main thing there is training your staff. And it's not just about cybersecurity awareness training, which you also need to have. A lot of you are probably familiar with security awareness training, and there's a lot of platforms and tools out there to provide that type of training to your staff, but it's not just that security awareness training. It's about creating a culture of awareness throughout the organization, and really, making sure you're talking about it regularly, whether that's staff meetings, internal meetings, training sessions that you do with your teams, or bring in experts to train you and your teams if necessary. This is complex stuff, and there's experts out there that can provide custom-based trainings for your organization to arm them with the right information that they need to protect your business and your data. But humans are the weakest link in your overall cybersecurity strategy. You can have the best, most bulletproof tools and protections in place on your infrastructure, but if you're not training and arming your staff to protect your business, you're going to get compromised. Years ago, it was a nice to have. It was a good security posture mechanism to have in place, but now it's a necessity. And it really starts with the leadership team first and foremost. So if you're not talking about it in your organization, and you're not talking about risk mitigation and the types of threats that exist for your industry and for your business individually, and whether, again, that's going to be day in and day out. If you're not doing that, you should be, and you need to be. Another component too that's a part of what's been introduced over the past number of years more so is remote working. So especially with COVID, that's introduced more complexities into the world of cybersecurity. But and I could talk a lot about this topic, but just a couple kind of key things to mention there is in a remote access environment, you really should be restricting access to only the necessary applications and systems that you need to get to remotely. There's no need to open up your entire infrastructure unless that's necessary, but typically it's not. And then certainly making sure you have all the proper technical safeguards in place on your infrastructure. So work with your IT team on that. Things like, secure VPN, multi-factor authentication, and really when you're opening up remote access, having it only accessible from company-owned devices, not letting access into your environment from home computers and personally owned computers. That's a key thing as well.
And
Go ahead, John. We're going to mention
no,
something.
no, my apologies. Continue. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So another kind of core area, which is on the slide there, is software patching. As you probably know, software vulnerabilities are exposed all the time. And having a proper patch management system in any computing environment is certainly a first level baseline type of good security posture. Because the reality is that when software is written, it's not perfect. And when it's used in the marketplace, vulnerabilities are identified, and certainly by way of different environments that it's run in. And those vulnerabilities can get exposed, and they do get exposed. And cyber criminals are always looking for those exposures and looking for new ways and different ways to expose a piece of code in software. So whether that's your operating system or the applications you use, it could even be the remote access mechanisms that you use to gain remote access to your environments. So these threat actors are constantly trying to identify vulnerabilities. And again, we need to stay ahead of that. There's so much information that's available and for purchase on the dark web and available for threat actors to utilize based on those findings and vulnerabilities that have been discovered. So again, the reality is we, as the experts here in IT, are just really always playing catch up because we're never going to be 100% secure. But what you can do is put the mechanisms in place to identify vulnerabilities, identify abnormalities, and have those mechanisms to protect against the known vulnerabilities that do exist. But the hackers will work to stay ahead of it all.
And one point I just wanted to kind of support, when we're talking about it's the people part of it, and that you can't replace the training that is so important in this, but also that it has to be consistent and ongoing. It's not a one and done. No matter how well you document your processes and procedures, training needs to be continuous. That's part of what I got from what we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
And Steve, what about other access issues?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Scott addressed, some of the real main, some of the real main points, right? It's certainly, the term that we're seeing used more and more frequently now is human risk, right? And it kind of takes that whole conversation of, the human as the weak link, and saying, well, certainly there are 100 could not agree more that that from the culture, building that security culture and providing them, providing employees with the proper training, not just awareness of the threats in the marketplace, but really specifically role-based information, like the things that they need to do, the things that they need to know to do their job securely. Those things are critical. But also, we can't just rely on the individual. Like certainly they're part of the team, and we need everybody kind of rowing in the same direction. But things like making sure that that you have proper authentication mechanisms in place. And Scott spoke to multi-factor authentication as a as kind of a foundational tool, right? Network segmentation, right? Making sure that people are only allowed to have access to the information that they need, right? These are things that we can do that are not just relying on individuals to do the right thing, or to not do the wrong thing, or not click that link, or have other kind of nefarious goals in mind from an insider threat perspective. But there are kind of procedural and operational and technical controls that can be put in place to to provide that those guardrails, so to speak.
Thank you, Stephen. So how are cyber criminals actually monetizing their attacks?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back, John, to what we were talking about, a few slides ago, right? In terms of the different kind of the different aspects of data protection. Essentially, when we're talking about financial services firms, again, this data is financial data, it's sensitive data. In addition to just outright, theft, which, again, that's there's mechanisms in place, anti-money laundering, et cetera. There's kind of processes and procedures in place for, authenticating, payments and transactions. Those are always direct targets. But then, the other side of the sensitive information conversation is the threat of ransomware, right? And so and then extortion based ransomware is another term, or double extortion ransomware. It's where they get your system and then they hold you ransom, so you not only can't get the information or use the information, but they threaten to expose it or sell it or release it on the dark web or some other means of embarrassing the company into paying. And then, we talked a little bit about hacktivism, and this kind of dovetails into, another scenario which we're seeing more and more of, which is just kind of, it's maybe not a direct financial, a direct financial hit, but hackers that are out there, specifically just to cause havoc, right? So with financial firms, in the financial services industry, certainly hacktivism is, there's an element of causing havoc, but it's really more about, damaging the firm's reputation, which obviously has, monetary or indirect financial impact. But then just, taking a system down, right? Doing a distributed denial of service attack where, a system goes offline for a period of time. Is there a particular monetary gain for the hacker? No, not necessarily. But again, indirectly, I guess there's some reputational damage, but operationally is an even higher risk, right? So hey, if I can't process payments, or if I'm not up and open for business, then I'm not making money, right? So I guess directly or indirectly, it all does come back to money, but there's different ways and different motivations depending on what the organization, the hacker organization is trying to accomplish.
Thank you very much. So finally, Scott, given the sophistication and drive of cyber criminals, how can FinServ organizations help mitigate risk? What steps can they take? Let's start with you, Scott.
Yeah, sure. So a couple things, as you can see on the screen, is, tools, but it's also culture, which we talked about just a minute ago, within your organization, educating, communicating around cybersecurity awareness. So your people, your largest vulnerability, right, as we spoke about, and helping them to keep you protected. But the tools as well. I'll speak to that in a minute. So kind of the tool sets have become more affordable for IT professionals over the past number of years, which is great, as I mentioned before. And some of these things which will allow us to have a more constant monitoring solution in place, rather than either point in time evaluations or point in time assessments or reactionary measures to try to find what happened and when and why. So we're certainly seeing more of that in terms of clients being more amenable and to implementing these tools and systems that they can now because they're more affordable. And the tool sets I'm speaking of they've been around for years. So been in the marketplace for years, but they were typically enterprise use tools. But again, as the markets demanded the need for it across and down to the SMB environment, there's more vendors in the space, the tool sets have become more affordable and mainstream in the typical SMB environment. And these tool sets really have excellent capabilities. For example, they can identify malicious types of activity occurring across your network and with communication and data traffic. And they can also be key for forensics type of work or investigative work when and if an incident does occur. So, and again, being prepared for when and if it does occur. And also being able to identify what data was accessed. That's kind of key thing. What was accessed, how it was accessed, and what was done with it. If you have data around what was accessed, how it was accessed, and when it was accessed, then that allows you to create a response mechanism to the public, whether it's your customers, your vendors, or whomever. You can do that in a more targeted fashion rather than just letting the entire world know that you had a compromise or an incident. That's obviously what you don't want to do, because your obligation when you do have an incident like that is to notify the affected parties. So basically, if you can be more pointed in who you're notifying, your risk of reputation damage is less by way of having information that allows you to identify why it was accessed and when it was accessed and how it was accessed, those kinds of things. In general, these are tools and systems that can monitor what's normal in your environment from a day-to-day perspective and what's abnormal. And the ability to identify what's abnormal and flag it, and then be able to identify, correlating other activities on the network or other devices, things that are similar to the abnormal activity. Where did they come from? Did a file get moved? Did a file get changed? Did something get sent? Did traffic come from abnormal IP addresses out on the internet that's not a normal type of content or traffic that you normally correspond with? Things like that. So having the ability to identify that in real time is hugely important, because then it allows you to obviously put a stop to it and identify what it was, address it immediately, rather than wait, weeks or months down the road. So having all these tools and systems in place to monitor and identify the vulnerabilities that exist, related to the infrastructure, whether it's penetrating your network, whether it's malware, software, things that are installed on edge devices such as your workstations and laptops. All these tool sets are certainly really important to have in place, and there's a kind of a myriad of systems out there that you can utilize for this. But what's important is to find the right mix, because there's a lot of different tools and systems out there, a lot of different vendors that provide these tool sets and systems. So finding the right mix and having the proper integration from an intelligence and information perspective. You can't just throw a whole bunch of tools at your infrastructure and expect it to be secure. You got to have a strategic approach as to what are the right tools, how do they integrate, what's the information I'm going to be able to get and correlate out of them, and then be able to take action and utilize it to protect your environment.
So the right tools essentially equate to the right data, which means the best insights that you can get.
Absolutely.
Steve, we talked a little bit earlier about the people side. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think it's I think everybody's probably familiar with the kind of the expression people, process, technology, right? And certainly whatever order you want to take that in, from where I sit, it's if you think about the processes that that run the business, right? What are the critical processes that run the business? Do you have the right policies in place to kind of define the rules of the road so that people know what they're supposed to do, the procedures for them to be able to follow those rules. Obviously, do you have the right people in place to to action those activities, and are they well trained? And we already talked about kind of the training, the training piece of it. And then to Scott's point about the technology, the way that I see the technology piece, it really is kind of, if you think about this this holistically, right? The technology is designed both as an enabler of those processes, and it's designed to help you enforce whatever those rules and requirements are around it. So it's certainly it does require, an effort, again, to Scott's point, in terms of really understanding, again, what are the critical systems that run the business, or what are the critical processes that run the business? What are the critical systems that support those processes? And now let's take a look at those, and let's prioritize making sure that we have, again, the right people, process, and technology around them to, both accomplish what we need to operationally, but also make sure that we do that in a secure way.
And that, I mean, taken together, that's all part of creating that cyber culture that we just discussed.
Culture and, kind of program strategy, right? And culture is definitely part of that, certainly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys. It's excellent discussion. Great points. Would like to take some questions from our participants. Scott, you talked about the availability of more affordable enterprise tools. Can you describe some of those available to small and mid-sized businesses?
Yeah, sure. So really the main tool set that I was speaking of is what's called SIEM, Security Information and Event Management Solution. So SIEM. And again, there's a number of different vendor platforms out there, a number of different variations of types of SIM. But in general, the idea is to provide visibility into your log data out of all your systems and software being used. And what that does is the ability to take all the data that gets logged in all of your pieces of software, all of your network infrastructure, all of your devices, all of your email communications, every piece of log data can be sent to a central system where it can then be correlated, which is a huge amount of data. It's these SIM tools aggregate and correlate a huge amount of data. But the idea there is to identify abnormalities and certainly to identify threats, but identify abnormalities as to something that's happening that's not normal day-to-day types of traffic or types of files being created or types of access or types of ways of software being used. It's able to identify the norm and then able to identify abnormalities. And that's what then raises a red flag for further investigation, stopping access, stopping a change, stopping whatever the abnormality or threat may be.
Steve, here's one for you. Actually, either one of you could take this, but we talked about the average cost of a breach. The question here is, we get that with the money, but what about the cost in practical terms, loss of revenue, productivity, and reputation?
Yeah.
How do you quantify that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it can be challenging or it can be really easy, John, right? So if you get hit and you go down for a day, a week, a month, right? You're unable to access systems, you're unable to operate, the cost is relatively easy to calculate. Take, your yearly revenue divided by 365, times however many days you're not producing whatever widgets you produce. And, that's your direct cost. Now, then you have recovery costs if there's damage, if there's, system damage, if there's costs associated with, like re-imaging systems or replacing devices or whatever the case may be. There's reputational costs that are a little bit harder to, calculate, but no less real, right? No less tangible. It's challenging, right? There's cyber insurance that covers, aspects of, of these costs. But it's a lot, I don't want to say easier to get cyber insurance because it's getting harder and harder. They're starting to get a little, they're tightening their the screws down a little bit in terms of the underwriting process, because there was a lot of breaches over the last couple of years that they've had to pay out on, and they don't want to do that, right? So the insurance companies have they have protocols and processes and procedures that they expect their insureds to follow, right? And those stipulations are getting tighter and tighter as well. You need to use their forensics firm, right? If you don't use their forensics firm, then all bets are off. So if you're not aware of some of those either stipulations or exclusions in your policy, then some of those risk mitigation techniques may or may not be effective for you. So it's not an easy it's not an easy effort to combat against, but certainly again it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of really defining again, what are the crown jewels, what does that mean in terms of the revenue making processes, how the business makes money, and focusing protection efforts on on those areas.
You also you referenced the cyber insurance.
Yeah.
And I think like any policy, part of what you need to know is what's in your policy, and you need to review it regularly. I think sometimes people have a set it and forget it attitude. But isn't that something that should be part of your thinking?
100%. Yeah, I mean that's certainly something that, and again, I get it. It's there's a lot of documentation that goes with policy language, and really understanding that is something that if you're gonna buy that buy that coverage, before you buy that coverage, you should know what some of those stipulations are, so that your program efforts can align, right?
Mhm.
Scott, I'm sorry if I interrupted you. Please.
And I was just going to say to add to what Steve was saying as well, similar to calculating your revenue production is to calculate your staffing cost per day and per hour, right? So take your fully loaded labor costs on an annual basis and divide that out in terms of number of days and number of hours, working hours, to add on to the impact to the business when and if there are outages and incidents. It's similar to the calculation of cost is similar to looking at disaster recovery and disaster preparedness scenarios as well, and looking at what the impact to the organization would be if you couldn't access your systems and couldn't produce your product or your service, and you have staff sitting around not able to do anything. So add that number into the calculation as well.
You need to clearly understand what you can withstand in terms of both downtime and data loss. There's this participant asks, there's a scary number you threw in there about hackers being in systems for a long time before they're detected. I think you said 233 days. In that case, what are they doing while they're in your system? Not just, of course, taking stuff out of it. What are they looking for, and what routes are they taking?
Yeah, it depends. So the access, the amount of time that they have potentially been in your systems can range from, a couple of days to 6 months to a year. It depends on what their intentions are. So, the ability, or the necessity, I should say, the ability and the necessity of having tool sets like the SIM platform, like I mentioned, are so important to be able to identify that and catch that. But yeah, I mean, their reconnaissance efforts vary drastically depending on what their intentions are. If they're looking just for a quick turnaround in terms of being able to encrypt the network and shut it down for a ransom, that can be a real quick thing. If they're looking to understand how you operate, what your workflows are, what sort of intellectual property you may possess, and be able to use that against you, use that to their monetary gain, that may take longer for them to do that reconnaissance work. So yeah, we've seen quite a range of that dwell time within an organization.
And we have one final question, and then I'll pose it to both of you. If you had to prioritize core cybersecurity needs for FinServ, what matters most?
Yeah, I can start. So number one, as we've talked about, training your staff first and foremost, creating that culture of cyber awareness. So it starts with the leadership team first and foremost. If you're not talking about it, if you're not making it part of your regular conversations and language, then you can't expect your staff to be doing that. So starts at the top down in terms of having that awareness and having that be first and foremost in people's minds when they're doing their daily jobs within your organizations. Test yourselves regularly. So doing pen testing, vulnerability scanning, something called tabletop testing, which is basically testing the what if scenarios. So testing your preparedness when and if an incident occurs and making sure you have all of the right plans in place, the right notification methods in place, the right people accountable for certain functions for the when and if. And that is all driven by having the necessary written policies in place. And Steve can, I'm sure, talk to that, where ensuring your staff are familiar with what your written policies are. So at a minimum, written information security policy as a core component on how you expect your staff to operate and do their jobs and work within the systems you're providing them. And then an incident response plan, certainly as well, for documenting how you're going to handle certain situations when they do occur.
Steve?
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth there, Scott. So, when you talk about, or when we talk about, I should say, kind of a programmatic approach, right? We talk about kind of that 360 approach to resilience, right? So obviously, you've got to have kind of on the proactive side, you've got to have the right controls in place. You've got to have that, that program strategy and those, again, kind of that control environment and those activities around doing your best to make sure that the bad guy can't get in, right? The flip side of that is, the what we call kind of the reactive risk management side, right? And that is basically in a nutshell. And again, Scott spoke to this just now and previously too, right? If you get hit in the face, how are you going to respond? Right? Like if you don't do anything, we say this to folks, all the time. We're not saying don't do anything. We're saying if you don't do anything else, the first thing you should do at minimum is at least have a plan, right? We call it a crisis management and incident response plan. There's kind of a couple of different aspects to that. The crisis management piece really is for senior leadership, right? This is not a technical response. This is, communications. This is, when do we contact cyber insurance? When do we contact the regulators? When do we contact our customers and let them know what's going on? When what's the messaging that we should use in those circumstances and scenarios, as well as the technical response piece of it, which, obviously is, feeding, kind of an input to those crisis management activities. But, again, we talked a little bit about, contingency planning and business continuity and disaster recovery. If the way we look at it is, again, if you're talking about a kind of a 360 degree program, wherever you start, wherever it makes the most sense for you to start is fine, right? Like it's progress. And so if by, a lot of times we see customers and prospects who, for whatever reason, they have a tough time, kind of rallying the troops to address these things proactively. And when we come in through a more, what I call kind of more of a reactive, but in a safe environment, right? That tabletop exercise that Scott was speaking to, there's a dual benefit, right? One is, hey, let's make sure we have a plan. Let's make sure that we test it and feel good to know that we have an idea of what we're supposed to do, in this circumstance. But the other benefit that comes out of that is the output of that is a feeder towards your proactive efforts, right? So when we do these exercises, these tabletop exercises, and we come out of it and we say, hey, this is what we need to do if, something bad happens. Well, okay, we identified that something bad happened. We identified how something bad happened. Now let's talk about making sure that it doesn't. And that's the proactive, kind of flip side of the coin with these two pieces.
Yeah, and I hate to use a cliche, but I'm going to, and that is failing to plan is planning to fail. And that's it in a nutshell. A good plan makes all the difference. Again, thanks, guys. Just a great conversation. And for our attendees, if you enjoyed this conversation, you'd like to build on it, join us for building bulletproof FinServ cyber protection. That's going to be on the 6th of June from 12 to 3 p.m. at Urban Lodge Brewing in Manchester, Connecticut. And what that's going to be is really an event that builds on what you've learned today and expands on everything, covering the newest forms of cyber attacks, the components you need to give your network infrastructure and people really ironclad protection. So it's a real holistic view of cybersecurity and the needs for financial services company. To register or learn more, just scan the QR code on this slide, and we will leave it up as we say our goodbyes. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today for Charting Evolving FinServ Cyber Threats. Steve, Scott, excellent discussions. Steve, can you give us any last thoughts, and you as well, Scott?
Yeah, no, I just appreciate the opportunity to be with you folks today. We will certainly be participating in the event on June 6th. If anyone wants to, feel free to come up and pull us aside and continue the conversation. We're happy to do that. Feel free to reach out. Obviously, we're again in step with the Coopsis guys, so they know how to reach us. If you have any questions you want to talk to us about between now and June 6th, we're happy to chat.
Scott, any final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, John, for moderating the conversation today. And as you can probably tell, there's so many topics to cover as it relates to protection and good practices, good hygiene. So certainly, inviting you guys all to join our next event, as we just talked about. So we'll touch on some other topics during that event, such as artificial intelligence and its integration to business operations, things like cyber secure business processes, just things to think about, like even things as simple as onboarding and offboarding employees, how much that can impact your cyber posture, if you will. Things like how to securely market your business and things to be aware of from a image and information sharing perspective as you're marketing and selling your products or services. And then probably a little further about like the third-party risk management. That's another big component that's come up, or not come up, but been brought to the top of the list in the past few years of securely, contracting with third parties and how to best navigate that aspect of doing business too. So looking forward to seeing you all on June 6th.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate that and all of the insights. Again, on behalf of all of us at Cooperative Systems, thanks for being part of this event and enjoy the rest of your day.